the purpose of the lecture today is to present you a sort of abridged version of the so-called Post-Keynesian or Keynesian growth and distribution models. And in a sense, I would like to put these positive alternative contributions by some Post-Keynesian authors in the context of the debate and in the context of the ideas that we have been discussing in the previous lecture regarding the neoclassical synthesis. So, and it will be important to bear in mind that because what we are going to see actually is how this group of Post-Keynesian authors try to rekindle Keynes, to put Keynes back into the economics agenda, both not only in terms of the economic policy, where Keynes' contributions have had a very important impact, but particularly on the economic theory debate. So next slide, please, Anton. Thank you. So this is a sort of overview of the different topics I will try to present here today. The first regards the thing or the feature that the so-called Solow model, the economic growth model put forth by Solow in the 50s, actually became sort of mainstream approach to the economic growth problems, but also to economic development problems for the sort of issues that have been emerging after the Second World War, in particular the debate around how to reconstruct Europe, and immediately after that, how to industrialize the developing world, and so on and so forth. And the thing is that Solow's model still today is very much used and employed for this sort of applied economic work. So this anti-Keynesian approach basically will be put in the center of the stage for this presentation, because it will allow us to go to the next point on the different criticisms which have been raised by some Post-Keynesian economists in Cambridge, and which eventually gave rise to the so-called Cambridge Capital Zero controversies. And in the context of those debates, I will present sort of a brief version of these Post-Keynesian contributions, in particular by taking into account the contribution of Joan Robinson, Nicholas Kaldor, and Luigi Pasinetti. And lastly, we will discuss a little bit on the alternative distribution theory, to what extent the alternative theory put forth by the Post-Keynesian authors actually became the approach which came to be held by heterodox economists, to what extent, and whether there are other versions connected with this Post-Keynesian school or not. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you a little bit of context again, because this was the last part of the presentation on Monday, and the salient feature of Solow model on economic growth is the fact that, according to the different endowment situations that any economy might be in, namely whether an economy is more labor endowed or less capital endowed, whatever that situation, the thing is that the economy sooner or later will be able to find the correct and optimal combination of resources, namely capital and labor, such that the output per worker and capital per worker will eventually converge towards this steady state equilibrium, right? So any point on the left-hand side of the equilibrium will mean that the capital is actually abundant, relatively abundant. Therefore, because of this, it will be convenient for entrepreneurs and firms to adopt more capital-intensive techniques of production, and eventually the capital per worker will be increased up to the steady state. The same here, I would like to raise two issues here regarding the assumptions made by Solow and other authors like Trevor Swan, etc. Is that the first thing is that technological progress is exogenous, so there is no endogenous mechanism inside the model which attempts to explain any technological progress. That is why in applied empirical work using the Solow model, they have to estimate the so-called residual, which actually means some sort of proxy to the exogenous nature of technological change in this model, right? So basically, this actually then became a sort of criticism by other neoclassical authors in the 1980s, right? The thing that how come can you explain that in terms of the empirical experience show that investment, and namely, investment and therefore capital has a positive relationship with the sort of new technologies being applied in these embedded capital goods, right? So, Solow model will not be able to apply to explain that situation, right? So that positive relation between investment and new capital goods, which eventually are manifestation, let's say, of this technological progress. That's one thing. And the second thing I would like to mention in regards of the Solow model is that the savings propensity, or you may say the marginal or average propensity to save, this lowercase s, actually also is an exogenous factor, right? So it's given by what, by whom or by what? It's given by the preferences and taste of the consumers in the economy, right? So departing from that analysis of consumption and utility and preferences, then consumers will be able to decide the level of consumption and therefore to keep a certain level of the savings. Okay, so the next slide, please. And so again, these are the basic mechanisms behind the model. And as explained before, we will always have a sort of methods of production or technique which will allow us to choose and to select the correct and optimal ratio between capital and labor, such that we can have this steady state equilibrium, right? Because basically, what is governing these sort of mechanisms is the fact that, according to the neoclassical theory, we have this principle of factor substitution, which actually can be applied to all of the factors of production. So I know for sure that you are all well aware of the fact that the principle of factor substitution first applied by David Ricardo in his analysis of capital accumulation and the theory of rents, right? So he did apply that principle of factor substitution for the case of the intensive use of land. However, when he managed to isolate the effect on the production of corn when more land is, for a given plot of land, we have more labor and capital being added to the production, then he was able to show us this diminishing returns law, okay? The difference, though, is that in Ricardo, what we had is that for the same amount of land, actually we are adding not a unit of capital isolated from a unit of labor. Actually, we have a sort of composite combination of factors, labor and capital all together. The difference here with the neoclassical approach in terms of this model is that the principle of factor substitution is being applied to the single factor of production, right? In particular to capital and labor here, right? So it's, in a sense, this was a sort of generalization of that classical principle applied to not only to land and labor capital, but to land, to labor and capital isolated from one another. All right, thank you. So the next slide, please. So this principle of factor substitution applied to factors of production like capital and labor was represented somehow in these models by this aggregate production function, and also sometimes referred to as the Cobb-Douglas production function. This is due to a paper wrote by these two authors in 1928, I think, who estimated empirically the retribution of the different factor of production to the contribution of output in the US economy. So this aggregate production function used by Solow and other authors actually is trying to convey the basic technical relationship which exists between factors and output, right? Because of some formal characteristics, we can also express this aggregate production function as in per capita terms, as we have seen before. And then we have these conditions these mathematical conditions that you can see, the first and second derivative, partial derivative for each of these factors. And you see, this actually means that the output will always be increased whenever you add one of these factors, capital of labor. But if you add further on the same factor, you can see in the second derivative sign, actually the diminishing returns law will be having an effect there. And what is actually what we can say out of this is that we have a sort of maximum, right, or limit to production. We cannot go further without increasing the other factor as well. So what is behind these assumptions is that there is a sort of scarcity of factors, right? So if you want to, even if you add labor more and more and more, if you don't add more capital, the output after a certain point will not increase any longer. Okay, so this is the representation of this factor substitution, right? And I mean, if you then, as you probably know, that if you try to use this function in order to make an optimization mathematical exercise, for example, to minimize cost or maximize profit for the economy, or for a single firm if you want, and then you can generalize it, then we will find that this demand or employment curves or functions derived from this analysis will show a negative relationship between the retribution of factors governed by the principle of the marginal productivity on the one hand, and the quantity of the factor employed. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the question is, and now I will try to connect that model with the following development from the critical, for a group of critics and critical authors in Cambridge. And the thing is that if we adopt a purely formal point of view in that aggregate production function, capital and the output, K and Y, must be homogeneous, right? So it doesn't make any sense to assume that capital will be expressed in value terms, because, I mean, you may have different physical capital goods for the same value situation when you want to aggregate the capital of the economy as a whole, right? So, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to assume it as a value unit, right? And so there might be some sort of homogeneous. There was not much of a clarity at that time about the units in which these magnitudes were expressed. Also, it could be regarded as sort of, if we assume that relative prices don't change, then we can assume they are some sort of composite commodities, right, on the side of the capital goods and on the side of output. But this, you know, I mean, if you wanted to stick to the meaning of a production function, which should be a mathematical representation of technical relationships, right? So what's the meaning of that function if we put some input in that function or some argument like K and L on the one hand, and the dependent variable, the output, on the other hand, right? If we measure those magnitudes in value terms, it does. I mean, the meaning of the production function would be totally different, because we wouldn't have anymore a definition, or a representation of a technical relationship, right? Because we can have actually, for the same technical relationship, we may have different values of the argument and the dependent variable, or the other way around. We may have different techniques for the same value of the input and output, right? So all this, I am being very brief on this. I mean, we can discuss this later if you want, if you have questions, but this sort of concerns were raised first raised by Joan Robinson in the so-called Cambridge capital theory controversies, and probably this perhaps was this sort of preoccupations which were at the center of the stage at that time. Interestingly, because as we will see later in the next slide, please, Joan Robinson, when she raised these concerns for the first time, was actually 1953, 53, 54, actually it was published in the Review of Economic Studies. And this was slightly earlier than Solow's own contribution, right? But somehow these were the sort of preoccupations that were already in the, at that time, in this, amongst this group of scholars, right? So, and now let me, I mean, this was more or less the situation in terms of the economic growth debates and models. Of course, there was, I mean, this has a very important implication on the economic policy debates, right? Because according to Solow's model, or to the neoclassical approach, any economy will be able eventually to find some sort of economic path where they will be able to choose the optimal combination of factors and will end up in a sort of steady state equilibrium. And this, of course, this view, this traditional or neoclassical view, disregards completely all the sort of problems that had been raised by Keynes in the 1930s, right? So in a sense, if you see what we discussed last lecture regarding the neoclassical synthesis was the fact that this a group of neoclassical authors like Higgs, Modigliani, then Patinkin, even Samuelson, etc., managed to absorb Keynes to the short-run problems of the neoclassical theory. Okay, so in a sense, Keynes was just you know, a footnote of the long-term neoclassical theory, right? And his contributions were put or were subsumed into the short run. Okay. Now, because once the neoclassical theory managed to adapt Keynes to the short period, then it was, let's say, the doors were opened for the neoclassical theory to try out a new approach to long-term economic growth and development issues and problems. And that was precisely the purpose of Solow's model. So in a sense, the post-Keynesian reaction and criticisms to these growth models in the 1950s and 1960s, I would say not only regard these technical aspects and differences in the theoretical approach and the, you know, this you know, this huge sort of disregard of Keynes' contribution, but it has, you know, a very important bearing on the economic policies debate at the time. So that is why I think, in a sense, there is another element. That is why the Cambridge controversies actually had a lot of impact, at least during that time in the 1960s and the 1970s, more or less, because they have, I mean, the sort of criticism that were raised, and we will see in what follows here and in the next lecture later on, we will see the implications for the neoclassical theory. That is why it had a lot of impact on the discipline, right? Not only in the heterodox camp, but also in the neoclassical authors who took part in the debate. Anyway, so let me go back to the to Joan Robinson. Actually, in her paper in 1953-54, she actually kicked off these controversies because she was the first, I mean, in terms of the published work, was the first to put on paper these concerns of the aggregation. What do we aggregate, or how can we aggregate heterogeneous stuff and put them together in a mathematical function, in mathematical form, such as we can depict the workings of the market economy according to this principle of factor substitution. And as I will show you in very shortly, the emphasis, and this is the interesting thing, in my opinion, the emphasis put in those criticisms on the part of Joan Robinson was on the meaning of equilibrium, or on the meaning of this steady state equilibrium, and how she and other authors managed to relate these concerns on equilibrium with some aspects that have been put forth by Keynes, which regard the problems for market economies around uncertainty and expectations, okay? So in a sense, my take on this post-Keynesian, or this branch of the post-Keynesian scholars, is that basically the Cambridge controversy were more or less, let's say, the battlefield where they would have been able to propose an alternative theory of accumulation and distribution, as we will see in the next slide. So, sorry, I put here that in the next lecture, of course, we will discuss other lines of the criticism that were received by the neoclassical theory in these Cambridge controversies. And sorry, I put the London time zone instead of Moscow. So at 3:40 p.m., I will discuss these other lines of the criticism. So can we go to the next slide, please? So I selected a few quotations by Joan Robinson, because on equilibrium specifically, because she actually focus very, very strongly on the meaning of equilibrium, and actually, I would say on the method of economic theory, right? But it is interesting because these controversies, Cambridge controversies, we normally see the label capital theory controversies or capital controversy, right? So it's around the issue of capital, and it's around the issue of how to measure capital, whether in the aggregate production function or in a general equilibrium setup, and so on. But the thing is that in Joan Robinson's view, this issue of the measurement of capital is possible only when we don't have any uncertainty about the future. In other words, when expectations are fulfilled. And it is because of this that she actually raised her strong criticism on the neoclassical theory, focusing on the equilibrium meaning and in the equilibrium concept. Okay, so that is why Robinson says the equilibrium requires that the rate of profit ruling today was expected to be ruling today when the investment in any plant now extant was made. So the thing is that when investment was made in the past, of course, there was a sort of profit rate. The question is, was that profit rate in the past estimated or was the ruling one? And that profit rate was ruling today or is ruling today, and that is only because of this matching of past and present profit rate values that capital can be measured, right? Because you can, for example, you can value your capital both by going back to the supply side of how your capital goods have been produced, right? So you go to the cost of the capital goods, and there is a profit rate implicitly there. And also you can go forward and estimate the value of your capital goods from what we could say the demand side, namely when you want to rent out your capital goods, you will discount the future returns by a certain rate of profit or rate of interest. Okay, so the past and the future coincide, and therefore you can measure capital. That is the basic concern of Joan Robinson. Okay, and that is why the expectation of future profits obtaining today was expected to obtain today, and thus the value of capital in existence today is equal to its supply price calculated in this manner. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The second part of the citation by Robinson says, the heavy weight which this method of valuing capital puts upon the assumption of equilibrium emphasizes the impossibility of valuing capital in an uncertain world. Okay, so note that for Robinson, the issue or the problem of capital or how to value capital, right, is intrinsically connected with the assumption that we are in a sort of certain world, right? So the idea is that had we been living in an uncertain world, it would have been totally impossible to value capital. Okay, so, and that is why she says, and I think that because of the many works that she wrote on these problems, relying on Keynesian insights, she wrote, in a world where unexpected events occur which alter values, the point of view of the man of deeds, namely the entrepreneur who makes investment decisions about the future, and of the man of words, namely the economist, making observations about the past, are irreconcilable. And all we can do is botch up some conventional method of measuring capital that will satisfy neither of them. So in other words, the thing is that for Joan Robinson, because of these Keynesian elements and Keynesian insights on uncertainty and expectations, and I would even say these characteristics of animal spirits on the entrepreneurs, the man of deeds, as Robinson puts it. All these elements actually, according to Robinson, prevent the theory from consistent and robust measurement of capital, right? Because if you want to measure the value of capital, you need to take into account some rate of profit or rate of interest, right? But in order to get that value of the rate of interest, therefore, you have to assume that the past coincides with the future, right? So that is the upshot of this post-Keynesian criticism regarding this. So, in other words, what is interesting here to note is that, well, if that is the situation, it is of course evident that we live in an uncertain world, and there are a lot of things that happen and that we have not expected in the past. We don't have perfect knowledge, and so on and so forth. So the question is how the profit rate or the rate of profit or rate of interest is determined by the economic theory. Okay, and this, according to Robinson, this puts actually the question how to determine this rate. There is a void, Robinson says in other works, there is a total void of the neoclassical theory or the mainstream theory as to how to determine this rate of profit. So the quest was, we have to determine this rate of profit, this rate of interest, and therefore we have to build up a new alternative theory of distribution. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the thing is that this battlefield was set just to show the discipline at large that the neoclassical theory is unable to show us how a rate of profit is determined or rate of interest is being determined by the supply and demand because of these issues of uncertainty, expectations, and all that. Okay, and this line of the criticism raised by Robinson in her first paper published, her first published paper on the controversies, was repeated and deepened further in other works, like in the 1955, in another work in 1956, her famous book, Accumulation of Capital, and in another book in 1962, and in many papers written in the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s, okay? And relying on this criticism, then an alternative approach to distribution and capital accumulation started to emerge in the context of the Cambridge controversy. Okay, and I basically, in what follows, I just based my presentation in particular on the work of Nicholas Kaldor, published in 1955, whose title specifically is Alternative Theories of Distribution. But if you go through the different presentations of the so-called Post-Keynesian or Cambridge equation theorists, by Nicholas Kaldor or Luigi Pazinetti or even Joan Robinson in 1962, but also in 1956 in her book, The Accumulation of Capital, we will see that more or less they will converge to the sort of theory of accumulation and distribution, which I will present in what follows. So in other words, what I am going now to present is precisely out of these criticisms. Then the question was how to build an alternative series of distribution, which takes into account the Keynesian insights and problems regarding or around the issues of uncertainty and expectations. So can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So again, these are the references to the main contributions to this line of the alternative post-Keynesian growth and distribution theory models. And I actually stress Nicholas Kaldor 1955 because I am going to present a sort of, a reduced version of that model. But again, I am happy to discuss any further this reconstruction. And the thing is, I would like to highlight a couple of features of the model and to discuss the the contribution of this model vis-a-vis the neoclassical approach, and also to open up the way for further discussion within this post-Keynesian literature, right, amongst different authors. Of course, I should have mentioned here Michał Kalecki's contribution, and in fact I will name it. I will name Kalecki's contribution on this accumulation of capital, accumulation and distribution model in the following slides, right? But anyway, we can discuss Kalecki as well. So let me briefly present these variables. So again, we have a sort of, let's say, a closed economy without international trade or finance whatsoever, and then Y, which stands for the income of the economy. So the aggregate income or aggregate output has to be distributed amongst wage earners, W, and profit earners. So all of the output will be resolved into wages, the wage bill of the economy, and the profits of the economy, right? Of course, in this model, we are disregarding or assuming that rents don't exist or are being kept constant. It's, of course, a simplification, right? So the second equation means this is the Keynesian, Keynesian or neoclassical macroeconomic equilibrium condition, but the assumption is that investment determines savings, right? So the second equation, it is from the left-hand side to determine the right-hand side of the equation. Investments do determine savings and not the other way around, as the neoclassical theory puts it. Then the third equation, this is a sort of contribution from this post-Keynesian literature on the fact that savings can be made out of both profit earners and wage earners. So basically, wage earners, workers can save some part of their wages, right? And therefore, they can decide to consume a certain amount of their wages and put apart some savings, and so on. Then we have the fourth and fifth equations. Actually, they are equations which define the amount of savings out of the workers or out of the wages, and the savings out of profit. So we have the lowercase SW and lowercase SP standing for the propensity to save for the workers and the propensity to save for the profit earners or capitalists, respectively, okay? Times the wage bill in equation 4 and times the profit, the total profit in equation 5. Now, you may ask, SW and SP lowercase, of course, are exogenous variables here. Eventually, they could be estimated with some sort of empirical work, but these are exogenous determined, right? And this is interesting because, in a sense, this is a contribution from the Keynesian perspective because Keynes himself hadn't put forward two different propensity to saves, right? To saving, right? And this is the first time in the literature that we can find out that we may have different savings rates for different social class. Okay, so can we go to next slide? Thank you. So out of some, manipulation of the equation from number 2 to number 5, and taking into account that it is investment that determines savings, we obtain that combining the equations on savings, so savings is the total amount out of the savings of the capitalist and the savings of the workers, all right? Because the wage bill actually is equal to the total income minus profits, okay? So we can combine this, this equation, and eventually we get that investment is the difference in the savings propensity amongst the different recipients of income, namely workers and capitalists, plus the propensity to save of workers times the total income of the economy. And if we divide by the by total income or output of the economy, we obtain the equation number 6, and then the equation number 7. Let's discuss these two equations a little bit because they have some important information for the theoretical purposes of this school of thought. So this number 6 equation says that the profit share of the economy, P over Y, okay, has a sort of relationship with the situation of the investment out of output. In a sense, the investment is the new you can imagine as the new capital goods being employed and being manufactured and then being employed in the economy. And it has, depending on the sign of SP minus SW, they will have a relationship with the profit share, right? And in fact, as we will see shortly, there is a condition for the stability of this model that the propensity to save of capitalists has to be greater than the propensity to save out of the wages, okay? And the equation number 7, again, you see, this is the same equation, but put in a different way. You have the profit share. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the equation, P over Y is the profit share, equals 1 over the difference in the propensities to save times some sort of capital accumulation variable, the investment over output, right? Minus some exogenous value given by the propensities to save, okay? So this is interesting because in other words, what we have is that in this model, Kaldor, but also Passinetti and Robinson and even Kaleski somehow actually are putting together the accumulation of capital and the distribution of income, right? In a single relationship, in a single equation. So let's try to examine this relationship deeper and try to draw some conclusions. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the distribution of income depends on the relationship between investment and output, given the propensities to save for the different social classes, right? However, there is a condition for this model to be stable, and not only the propensity to save out of profit has to be different from the propensity to save out of wages, because in that case, if they were equal, we would have that both will be the denominator on both terms on the right-hand side of the equation would be 0, and therefore it will be the equation will be indeterminate, right? So, but also not only they have to be different, but the thing is that for stability analysis, What means? It means that if we move out of equilibrium, then for the system to come back to a new equilibrium, but a stable equilibrium, this is the meaning of stability, we need that the propensity to save out of profit be greater than the propensity to save out of wages. And this has, of course, a strong bearing with Keynesian ideas, namely that it is, at least plausible to assume that workers have a greater propensity to consume than the capitalists or the entrepreneurs, right? And therefore, the propensity to save of the workers will be plausibly assumed to be lower than the propensity to save of the capitalist, okay? And of course, once we grant, relying on Keynesian insights, that the propensity to save out of profits is greater than the propensity to save out of wages, then we have the positive relationship linking profit or the profit share and investment or accumulation on the other hand, right? So that is the chief result that this post-Keynesian branch has actually arrived at. And if we take, interestingly, if we take that the propensity to save out of wages is zero, and this is the Kalecki's model, right? Or Kalecki's assumption, sorry. And we end up in his model where the workers will consume all of their income because they don't save, and the capitalist class will earn all their consumption, right? Not the single capitalist, but the capitalist as a whole will earn all of their consumption, both in capital goods and in consumption goods. And can we go to the next slide, please? So what are the mechanisms behind this model and this equation? So the basic idea is that relying on Keynesian elements like animal spirit, expectations upon future profits, and the situation of the economy, and so on and so forth, if we assume investment being exogenous and there is an increase in investment, there will be an increase in aggregate demand. Keeping the full employment assumption, that is an interesting and somehow, for some reasons, striking assumption that this literature has put forth, that given the full employment, okay, it will be plausible to expect that there will be an increase in the price of the economy, in the price level of the economy, some price index whatsoever, because an increase in aggregate demand will make prices go up, and this will entail a fall in the real wages, okay? So workers will be worse off, and this will give rise to a fall in consumption, and therefore the fall in consumption goods will entail a decrease in the production of consumption goods, and precisely because it is needed, these resources are needed, and therefore they have to be released in order to produce capital goods, which were ordered by the increase in investment decisions. Okay. So this is the upshot of this approach or model, and the degree or the, let's say, intensiveness of the changes in the income distribution will chiefly depend on the difference, on the gap between the different propensities to save. Of course, in the case of when workers don't save, then the propensity to save out of profit will be the propensity of savings, the savings propensity of the economy as a whole. And in that case, the relationship will be straightforward, right? If you look into the different versions of this standard post-Keynesian model, like, for example, Passinetti's 1962 article, and he says, interestingly, that if workers save, if we assume that workers can save something out of their income in wages, then these workers will be able to invest that money into some sort of stock market shares, bonds, whatsoever. And eventually they will have to be treated as sort of capitalist as well. So there is no much sense, he says, to regard these savings out of work, savings out of the wage bill, right? So, and that's an interesting insight in the Passinetti's model. So we have different versions with different nuances around this model, right? But the main conclusion is that basically we have a positive relationship between the accumulation of capital and the profit share. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so interestingly, if we adopt the assumption of the fact that workers consume all of their wages, they don't save, okay, then the propensity to save the economy will be the propensity, the savings propensity of capitalists. And then the equation 7 will be the one we have here, which is 7 prime, right? Which is the profit share is equal to the inverse of the savings propensity of the economy times the investment output relationship or ratio. All right. Now you can cancel out the income from that equation and you can divide both sides by the capital, the stock of capital in the economy. And we get that relationship, which is the key relationship for this approach. Given the definition of the profit rate, which is P over K, namely total profits over total capital on the one hand, and the accumulation of capital or some sort of proxy variable to the growth rate of the accumulation of capital, which is G, given by the relationship between I and K, namely the new capital goods being invested slash produced over the capital stock. Okay, so combining this, eventually we get that the left-hand side of the equation, PK, is R, namely the profit rate, and it is equal to the inverse of the propensity to save, to savings in the economy, times the accumulation of capital, G. Okay, and that is the so-called Cambridge equation, namely G equals the propensity to savings times the profit rate. And as you can see from that equation, from that Cambridge equation, we have a positive relationship between profit rate and accumulation of capital. Okay, so the higher the profit rate, the higher the accumulation of capital, which actually would mean the lower the wage rate, the higher the accumulation of capital as well. Okay, so this is the most important result of this approach, this post-Keynesian approach. Can we go to the next slide? So there is a series of accumulation conditioned by the distribution of income, in that case, the profit rate, given, of course, the propensity to save. This is the core of this post-Keynesian, at least this post-Keynesian branch of the theory of accumulation, right? So basically they combine, I would say, for the first time in the history of economic ideas during the 20th centuries, from a known neoclassical or orthodox point of view, we have a formal model connecting accumulation and income distribution. Of course, you can say that, yes, we have something of this in the classical political economists or Marx and many other authors who were not neoclassical economists, of course, but that is what I'm trying to say. This was made probably for the first time in the history of economic ideas for a formal model to be put forward, right, in formal terms, mathematically, and all these things. And this then also opened the way for the so-called profit-led growth models in some neo-Keyesian approaches developed in the 1980s and 1990s, are very much more recently in recent decades by several heterodox authors. So can we go to the next slide? And just as a way of open up a sort of discussion around these alternative theories of distribution. So, and one question or one way to approach a critical reading of this model is to ask if it is legitimate to postulate as a general outcome, as a general rule, that in order to accumulate capital, we need a higher profit rate, right? So it would, I mean, if you try to think through this model and apply it to understand, for example, historical trends in the capitalist world, I mean, any time in the 20th century, it's interestingly to note, it would be interesting to know that we can actually find the opposite at some growth trajectories for different countries, namely periods of time where the accumulation of capital was on the rise, was increasing with higher level of the wages, not the opposite, not lower levels of wages, right? Of course, we can also sort out situations in which we have higher accumulation of capital and economic growth with lower wages and therefore higher profit rate. For example, you may think of the Chinese experience over the last decades. However, yes, that might be true for some period of time, but also we can acknowledge some leveling off the wages during more recent years, for example. So, I mean, this could be more subtle to disentangle, right? And that is one thing. So it would, I think it would be legitimate to assess, to examine this approach by looking at the historical record, to the historical experiences, trajectories, and so on. But also there is another way to, I would say or suggest, another way to look critically at this model, and is by this G, this accumulation of capital variable or growth variable, G. Is it a theoretical variable or is it an empirical variable? Okay, so if it is an empirical variable, namely what we can actually see from the empirical experience, then what is its relationship, its inner relationship in general terms with the normal income distribution, with the theoretical profit rate, or sort of normal profit rate, or sort of long period average profit rate of the economy, right? So if we go to the next slide, please, then this debate around the around whether this accumulation of capital variable is empirical or theoretical has been put forth by other interpreters, other authors like Garegnani, Palumbo, and other Italian authors, and also from other countries as well, very much influenced by the work of Piero Sraffa. And basically they say that there is no positive relationship, general relationship between accumulation and the profit rate. Sorry, I wrote between accumulation and income distribution. I should have written between accumulation and the profit rate. Sorry about that. So why? Because according to this branch of the, let's say, Post-Keynesian school or heterodox camp, whatever, the thing is that if this accumulation of capital variable is a proxy, it's an empirical proxy of what's going on in the real economy, right? So this G will chiefly depend on the level of the utilization of the productive capacity. This is an interesting Kaleskian insight, right? So the idea of these different levels of utilization of productive capacity means that basically for market economies and mostly industrialized economies, but also developing countries, you can apply the same concept. The thing is that for the different manufacturing sectors, you will not be at the 100% level of the capacity utilization. So the idea is basically that for market economies, that is why it is Keyneskian, right? Because he said this thing about, relying on Marx's insights on the anarchy of the market, or the anarchy of the exchange market economy. This association between the production side of the economy and the distribution and consumption side. This means that for these economies, the firms and entrepreneurs have to spare some level of their capacity, or their productive capacity, in order to meet eventually some increase in demand, right? So any firm or any sector, if you want to aggregate, there we can actually see from the empirical record that many manufacturing sectors, normally they are not using the 100% of their productive capacity, and they actually save some level of capacity in order to meet for new demand forthcoming. Of course, in period of recession and drop in the aggregate demand, the level of productive capacity of utilization is very much low, right? Because there is no aggregate demand, and therefore they can survive. Some of them can survive by using 50% or 40% or 60% or 30% whatsoever. So basically, the manufacturing sectors normally are not at 100% of the level of utilization of their productive capacity. So because of this, right, because of this situation, an issue will arise, and this is the following. When you have to calculate the profit rate, okay, when you have to calculate the profit rate, let's assume that we have some notion of a sort of normal profit rate, right? So basically you will have to do the math by combining how much you will earn, right? So you have some sort of estimate, okay, by dividing for all the cost of production of the new capital goods, of the new investment being made, right? No, not on the investment or capital goods that are already extant in the factories for the different manufacturing sectors, right? So it is on the new capital goods where you will calculate the profit rate. And therefore, this opens the question on, again, how to connect, in general terms, this profit rate on the one hand and the accumulation of capital on the other hand. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So basically, as I have tried to convey here, we may know that there is a divide amongst different post-Keynesian economists on the interpretation of the so-called Cambridge equation, right? And this gives rise to different, actually, readings of the tendencies, of the empirical tendencies of the market economies. On a more general level, from the perspective of the history of economic ideas, perhaps, the thing is that even after all the fuss and all the controversies around the capital theory or capital theoretic problems during the Cambridge controversy, still there was no alternative theory of distribution that emerged and was successfully established in the discipline. We have still different heterodox or alternative theory of distributions, but they have different implications, right? Even after these controversies. And even though the neoclassical approach underwent a deep theoretical crisis at that time in the 1950s and 60s, I will talk about this transformation of the neoclassical theory in the next lecture. So thank you.